You are now entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and my favorite moment of all of the clones is when Ahsoka removes Rex's helmet during the Order 66, and it is a touching and memorable moment for me.
And I'm Carmelo, and my favorite moment, which is a disturbing moment, is the Battle of Umbara in Clone Wars, because we get to see the humanity of clones in it.
In our journeys through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about clones because we find them fascinating and they are a fundamental element in Star Wars. We're going to be focusing much more on the television shows because it is true that they appear in episode 2 and episode 3 of the prequel trilogy. But it really is in the Filoni's The Clone Wars where we get to see the development of them as characters. They do show up in the Tarkovsky's show, but even there, they still have the sort of feel of a collective of soldiers. But we really get to see a lot more about them with the Clone Wars. We're going to be focusing quite a bit in the television show. And Nick, I think it would be really nice to start with this whole idea of the uniqueness of the clone in Star Wars. It's called Star Wars. This is all about militarizing the galaxy. But they have some really unique things about them that makes them different from stormtroopers, that makes them different from other kinds of soldiers. So I'd love to start with that. If you want to start, and I'll just keep going from there.
Yeah. So we, like you said, we see them in the prequel trilogy, but they're really more in the background. We don't really get to a lot of interaction or get to know who they are. I think really that Clone Wars series is kind of the first time maybe in Star Wars we really get to interact with just soldiers instead of Jedi or any of the main characters. We maybe in the expanded universe we do get more of that, but as far as like film and TV, that's really the first time we get to know who's on the front lines and what they're doing and kind of how their experience plays out. But one thing I always found fascinating, even in the original trilogy, we never see a stormtrooper take off his helmet or see their faces. Mm-hmm. Even in the Rebels that we do get to see outside of the pilots, we don't really get to know any of those characters. So the clones really, I find it funny how they all have the same face. But that doesn't define them. They base it off their experiences.
Yes,
it's very fascinating, that nature versus nurture kind of thing.
Yes,
we can all kind of we can come from the same place, but what we go through,
it's the same genetic pool. It's the same genetic pool, but they all have personalities. They all have different ways of doing things and behaving and all of that. And it's one of the wonderful things. Clones keep repeating in the show, we are clones, but we are individuals. Mm-hmm. And they do it by, shaving their heads or not shaving their heads and cutting their hair in different ways and tattoos in their face, paintings in their helmet. There are all of these ways in which the clones sort of find ways of being different from others. They recognize that they're all brothers and they call each other brothers. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they also want to stress their individuality by finding visual cues. And you're right. This is the really interesting thing about clones. They're constantly taking their helmets off. Yeah. Stormtroopers, the first stormtrooper that does that is Finn. We just never see them. They're just like a mass of soldiers. And so there's something really wonderful about the clones, because these are not just, cannon fodder. They are individuals fighting for the Republic. And I think one of the marvelous things about Clone Wars as a show is that we get to see who the soldiers are. And that I find quite remarkable, really, really quite remarkable. Filoni, I don't remember where he said it, but he mentioned how much soldiers and veterans in the US identify with the clones, and that they found this sort of connection with them. Once again, because stormtroopers are just this mass of soldiers, but clones are individuals. And I think veterans and soldiers sort of found a way of seeing themselves in them.
Mhm.
because of the different personalities, because of the different conflicts of being a soldier. I've always found it really interesting. I'm not a veteran, but I find it that it is a really wonderful and sort of respectful representation of the soldier with all of the conflicts that exist.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that. I have never thought of that actually. I'm not a member of the military, or never was, so that never really crossed my mind. But yeah, that kind of, when we spend time with them during the Clone Wars, and like we said, we don't really ever talk to them or get to know them in the prequels. So I guess for me, I kind of went back and watched the prequels after spending all the time with them in the Clone Wars, and um, some of them kind of are created specifically for the TV show, but you get the sense that no one clone is alike. So when
Mhm,
Order
mhm,
66 does happen in Episode
mhm.
3, it kind of hits a little harder, that because you know how you seen the bond between the Jedi and the
Yeah.
troopers, like they formed a really strong bond, and it was kind of brought together because of a war, which I guess is not really uncommon for Star Wars, but but finding bonds through troubling times. But it's
We-
fascinating.
but that's why, in a way, the last four episodes of Clone Wars with Order 66 happening there, in a way, that's why it's so moving,
Mhm.
because we have had 7 seasons of the Jedi and the clones creating a relationship, creating like a real human affective connection.
Mhm.
And so when Order 66 happens at the end, I'm sorry, it just broke my heart.
Yeah.
Rex there with tears in his eyes, needing to kill Ahsoka but refusing to do it. It's just, that's where you see the humanity of the clones.
Mhm.
That's where you see that they're not just droids,
Right.
mechanical beings or biological beings made in a laboratory. That's where you see that these are people
Right.
just like everybody else. There's something that you said, and I actually don't remember what you said that triggered this in my head. But it's really important that the very first episode of Clone Wars, called Ambush,
Mhm.
it's one that doesn't focus on Anakin. It doesn't focus on Kenobi. It's Yoda and 3 clones. I've always really liked that first episode because it gives us a sense of how, as we say, how the Jedi view the clones, how Yoda views the clones. Um, and it also gives us a sense that this show is going to be about what it means to be a soldier, and all of the things that happens when you are a soldier. I love that moment at the end of the episode when Yoda says, "Take your helmets off," and they're like, "Why should we take our helmets off? We all look alike."
Right.
And he says, "In the Force, you are different people." I don't remember the exact line, but in the Force, you are 3 individuals. You are not
Yeah.
just 3 identical beings. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of starting this whole 7 season world of
Yeah.
of the wars itself.
Funny you mentioned season 7. There was another moment from season 7 that I thought was very fascinating, when right before Order 66 happens, they heading back to Coruscant with Maul, and Rex and Ahsoka are having a conversation about this could be the end of the war. Things seem like they're coming to an end, and they're both kind of, they both get that, you both see they're kind of relieved that it's about to be over. And I can't remember verbatim what the conversation goes, but Rex basically says that, what's our purpose going to be, and you know, we were created for war, and now that the war's over, what now? And um, they've talked about all the conflict and the loss they faced
Yeah,
through
yeah.
war. At least something good came of it. I got to, basically got to meet you and experience, have all these memories with you guys. And of course, the hat drops a few minutes later, so that just
Right.
makes it even worse. So that makes it worse. But that made me think that, um, these clones, like you said, Yoda tells them to take their helmet off, and they're 3 individuals in the Force. The Force doesn't recognize them as just one person. They
Mhm.
each have a pulse. They each have a heart. And I find it fascinating too that they were designed for war, but we do see countless examples of clones, either abandoning or just kind of leaving the post. And in the beginning, like that episode with Yoda, you said they think, and at that point I assume they think they are, that's just what they're there for. They're there to do a
Mhm.
job. and the Jedi are probably just there to do a job. But you see them, especially Ahsoka, I believe, and Anakin more so, that they get a bond with their troopers. And I think Rex, being one of my favorite characters, I think him spending time with both Ahsoka and Anakin, he has the biggest character development to me. He becomes a fan favorite, and I think you see multiple times throughout the series that him working with Anakin so much, he kind of bends the rules a little bit because of who Anakin is. Anakin kind of taught him that, I guess, in a way. So it's like that nature versus nurture thing I mentioned earlier. So if he had maybe, Mace Windu as his, Jedi partner, would he probably do that? Who knows? But
Right.
again, I
Right.
think Anakin and other Jedi had a big influence on who they are. Um, it's just very fun to see that. And I think for the most part, other than Paul and Krill that you mentioned in the intro, a lot of them, they treat them as people.
I think that in a way, that's why Ponkrell is so disturbing.
Yeah.
Because we have been watching this very beautiful relationship between the Jedi and the clones. And then Ponkrell shows up and he thinks of them as lab rats.
Yeah.
And it's just shocking. I remember the first time I saw that episode when Ponkrell calls Rex by his number, and not by Captain Rex or whatever he was at that time, Commander Rex, whatever he was. And it was sort of like, oh, that's right, he has a number, because I had forgotten. Like he's just Rex. But Ponkrell sort of like diminishes him to the number. Right. And so it's really, because we have seen such an amazing connection with the Jedi, that those 5 episodes of the Battle of Umbara are very disturbing, very, very disturbing, because we sort of see a different way of looking at the clones, which is not unlike the way the Kaminoans think of them. I mean, they keep talking about them as property.
Right.
They're not. They might be clones made out of human DNA, but the Kaminoans don't think of them as human. They're not. They're sort of like a different category. They're biological, but they're manufactured. They're made, and so the Kaminoans don't think of them as regular humans.
Yeah, I guess you could see it kind of like a weird middle ground where they're not quite droids, but they're not quite human either. So they're like a step above droids, but a step below, humans and living beings. So it's fascinating how that happens.
It's something that I mentioned in my book, that is really fascinating, that in the Clone Wars, the Separatists create a droid army and the Republic creates a clone army. And in both sides, they're both creating a soldier to, so the citizens of the planets do not have to fight the war.
I think if you look at Ahsoka, she's our point of view character during the Clone Wars. We get to see kind of the life of a Padawan during this, controversial time in the galaxy. And they are both, in a way, I can't remember. I remember Ahsoka vaguely mentioning this at some point. I don't remember. I'm very bad at remembering episodes and seasons, but she mentioned something about, her whole time as a Padawan. It's been a war. There's been a war going on. And that's all she's ever known. So what is she going to do after that? And it's very similar to how the clones, their purpose was for the war. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. And they're both different, obviously, because the Jedi have more of a code and a strict code, and the clones, they're created in the lab, and they don't really. The purpose was for the war, and we get to find that out in the Bad Batch. Kind of what do we do after that's over? What do we don't need them anymore?
Right.
But I found it very fascinating. We get to see on both sides that the war has different outcomes for Jedi and for the clones. Like Barriss Offee, she takes a different direction than Ahsoka.
Right.
Becomes very radical.
Right.
And we get to see that with clones too. We get to see them kind of questioning why we're here. Like we get to see Cutler Quain, who says, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for any of this. I want to do my own thing.
All of these things are sort of, it's one more element of sort of stressing the individuality of the clones.
Yeah.
That they're all going to have different reactions to it. That they're not droids in that sense. They're not simply following a code that was sort of put in there. And it's really interesting, that Rex has the chip, but he's growing with the Jedi makes him hesitate when it is time to kill the Jedi.
Kind of a
so there is what the brain tells you to do, but there's also the individual sort of having some agency about what I want to do. And Rex sort of recognizes that there is something that his brain is telling him to do that he doesn't want to do. I also like what you said about the Padawan, because I hadn't thought about it this way, that they're both the clones and the Padawans during the Clone Wars are sort of thrown into war. The clones are made for war, but the Padawans are sort of forced into it. They're not even Jedi Masters yet, or Knights. They're just in the process of becoming Jedi, and then all of a sudden they have to participate in the war. And so there's this really interesting, internal conflict about, we're part of the order, but we are doing what we're not really supposed to do anymore. And it's really interesting because the High Republic Padawans have a little bit of that too. Sort of like, we've been trained with lightsabers, but we didn't think we were going to use them.
Yeah.
There are all of these moments in the young adult novels and in the junior novels where the Padawans are sort of like, wait, I have to kill somebody? I have to cut someone's arms now? And so there's this really interesting idea of the order is telling you to do something, and then the world does something else. Clones don't have that. Clones were trained for war, and you still get the question, and you still get the different opinions, the different ways of dealing with the way the war is working. They're as real and three-dimensional as everybody else, and that show is responsible for making them that way. If we could leave the galaxy for a moment, I think Star Wars is very much an American product. And the idea that the story of Star Wars is a story of war is something that is, I think, very essential to the way sort of American society has grown. The idea of a militarized society, I think there are lots of parallels to what has happened in the US in different ways. I think the difference is that, at least in the 20th century, war has not really happened in the US. It has always happened somewhere else. And in Star Wars, that doesn't happen. In Star Wars, war is everywhere, even in Coruscant, even in the capital. And so I think you're correct. I don't know that Filoni sat on the table and said, this is going to be an allegory of the US. I don't think so. But I think it's sort of, the connection is unavoidable. What I said at the beginning about sort of that connection that soldiers and veterans sort of connect with the clones in the show is because they sort of see sort of the machinations of war and all the things that you have to deal with, that you have to negotiate through when you are a soldier, when you are representing a nation, when you are fighting either for an idea or a country or a planet, or for your brothers or for your fellow soldiers at that moment, in that moment of history. I think that's sort of, in a way, sort of very part of the American cultural ethos.
It's funny, we see that in the Clone Wars and in real life when the clones go to a certain planet and the natives of that planet are like, get out of here, we don't want nothing to do with that. And we see that all the time. In our
it's one of the narratives that happens in
shop, and they're like, nope, we don't want anything to do with this.
Yes.
So it's very wow. Yeah.
Now all of that is connected. All of that is very much connected. I don't know that but we have to think of it as a deliberate allegory. I don't think it was sort of like, let's revisit Vietnam here, or let's revisit the invasion of Latin American countries. But it's there. It's just there. It's part of It's part of the way it is represented. Star Wars is an American product, period. If Germans were doing this, it would be very different. If Mexicans, my God, a Mexican Star Wars, I'm really curious about a Mexican Star Wars. There would be a lot more women as Jedi because they had female soldiers all over the Mexican Revolution. I think it would be really awesome, Nick, to finish the episode with the Bad Batch. One of the things that I have enjoyed about the Bad Batch is the different ways that different clones react to the end.
Yeah.
Because I appreciate, as I said in the podcast, I am not a veteran. I've never been in service, but I appreciate that the shows recognize that individual soldiers are going to have different issues returning home. It's really interesting that it's not just sort of like, and we all have PTSD and go home.
Right.
There are different ways of processing the end. There are different ways of reacting to what is happening. There are different ways. Some of them are going to say, well, I'm a soldier, this is what I do. Or some people like Crosshair, sort of like, my chip is removed. I believe in this. This is what I want to do. This is the only way to maintain stability in a galactic society. And so I really appreciate that we're getting different ways of thinking about this.
The fascinating thing, I guess we don't know at this time of the recording, we don't know where the future of the clones are going. We do know Bad Batch is coming back for season 2, but we don't see them a lot when it comes to even in Star Wars Rebels or any other future media. We don't see a lot of them hanging around. So it'll be interesting to see where it ends up. And the Bad Batch has brought up some questions that I didn't really consider, I guess, when I first was announced, or when I first started watching it. I was kind of like, thought it was going to be a fun action, little A-team kind of story. And it's not my favorite thing in Star Wars, but I've enjoyed it, and I think it brought up some questions and some thoughts that I didn't really consider when it came
I rolled my eyes when I heard that there was going to be an entire season of the Bad Batch, and I'm like, oh God, it's going to be a testosterone special for 16 episodes of rah 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 kind of thing, and it wasn't. Right. And so I actually came into the show with very low expectations because I was expecting, those 4 episodes from the end of the Clone Wars to just get replicated, and it wasn't. And that I found really interesting. You mentioned Rebels, and I hadn't thought about that, but it's really interesting because we get to meet Rex and Gregor. And so we have this sort of little bunch of clones of like what happens after.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna put my gay hat for a second here. Besides the fact that they are incredibly sexy as sort of thick bearded, bald-headed men, it's fun to see them grow old.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see them take up the Rebel Alliance in its sort of infancy, in its beginnings, of sort of once again proving their individuality, that they're just not following orders. That now there's a moment, I think it's Gregor that says, it's really wonderful to finally fight for something we are deciding to fight for, rather than fighting for the Clone Wars because that's what we were made for. Now we are fighting for something that we want to fight for. So that's really fun. That's really fun. And they're sexy. Oh my God, they're just so pretty. Oh.
One thing I'm curious about, since we're talking about Rebels, is we see, Kanan's reaction when he finds clones again. It's the first time he's seen clones since he was a Padawan. And in the Bad Batch, I'm curious. We haven't seen any Jedi since Order 66. So I'm wondering if in the future, I don't know if this is any kind of planned or anything, but we'll let us see what happens when we see some clones like Rex or the Bad Batch run into some Jedi or a Jedi, and are they going to believe them? Are they going to, kind of like Kanan? He kind of flipped. He was like, no. Last time I saw these guys,
You're right. You're right. Last time I saw you, you wanted to kill me.
and it's a different time period because at that time it's been years since Order 66, and this it's
Right.
still recent, so they're probably still on the run and still
Right.
being looked out for by the Empire. And during that time, there's probably not. I don't think there's not that many Jedi out, so I doubt they're really actively hunting all the Jedi.
And thank you for pointing out that narrative arc of Kanan and Rex, because it once again proves this idea of how the world views clones and how the Jedi have viewed clones after Order 66. And Rex has to prove to Kanan that he is not this sort of generic stereotype of, post Order 66, all clones are Jedi killers.
I was going to say, I guess we're going to wrap up here in a second.
We should.
Say, yeah, we could go all day. Clone Wars was a formidable time in my life because it was, at the time, I didn't have access to books and comics like I do now as an adult. So that was my Star Wars, and it was very fun, and it was surprising because I didn't think much of it at the time, the depth that was into that show. And then as I got older, I realized there's a lot here. That's saying a lot more than I realized originally. I thought it was more of just an action Saturday morning cartoon, and there is some, obviously, because it's for kids, but there's a lot of layers to it. And some of the clones have become some of my favorite characters.
Yeah, I was pretty late to Clone Wars. I don't remember when I started watching, but it was certainly after season 6, after the Netflix season. I watched them on my phone on the train.
Oh wow.
Like when I was done with school and I had a 25-minute train ride express back to the suburbs, and I would just like be in my seat watching an episode of Clone Wars every day.
When we first mentioned the intro of the show, we don't get to spend a lot of time with them during the films, the prequel films, and that's what Lucas said when he created the Clone Wars. He said, "We didn't get to know these characters. We don't know anything." He said, "I think there's a lot there, and obviously the rest is history." So I think
Star Wars. Yeah, I think Star Wars gets really good on television.
Yeah, it does.
It really does. It really does. I think there's so much that Star Wars really blooms on television. And on that note, we're done. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, audience. We'll see you in the next podcast.
Take care, guys.
Bye.